Well, it is my honor and privilege to introduce John W. Reid. He is a conservationist and economist whose writing has appeared in outlets including the New York Times and Scientific American. He's the founder and former head of Conservation Strategy Fund, winner of the MacArthur Foundation Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. He currently serves as senior economist for the nonprofit Niatiro and lives in Sebastopol, California. Did I say those right? Yeah. All right. Everyone, please welcome John W. Reid.
Thanks, Andy. And you guys are my people. Thanks for being here. I'm going to read from this book, a book called Evergreen that I co-authored with the late biologist Tom Lovejoy. And I'm going to get right into the reading. And when I emailed before the festival and asked Sam, so what do people like there? You know, what's the format that works for your crowd here? And he said, well, you can read for 10 or 15 minutes. And that's a lot more than I've been reading in other venues. So you guys must have a good attention span. And I'm going to count on that, and I'm going to read a couple of passages, talk very briefly about the origins of this book and its conclusions. But I'd love to have a conversation. So given that you are my people, I would invite you to think about some questions, and we can have a chat for the balance of the hour. Sound good? Okay. So this book is about the 5 biggest forests in the world, which are 2 boreal forests and 3 tropical forests. The boreal forests cover one of them, the northern part of Canada and Alaska. The other one stretches all the way across Russia and into Scandinavia. And the tropical forests, you may have guessed, Amazon Basin. The other 2 are the Congo Basin and the island of New Guinea. And various research projects to map the world's forests over the last 20 years, really, as satellite data got better and free to scientists, have zeroed in on these places that are the least fragmented, most intact forest ecosystems on our planet. And the forest book that Tom and I set out to write was about how these intact forest ecosystems have this surpassing, not always recognized importance for the climatic stability of our planet, for our biodiversity, and for the cultural diversity of the planet. And so those are the things that we get into in the book. And as we were writing it, the sort of gestalt around climate change and the carbon argument got stronger and stronger, and as it continues to do. And so the first thing I'm going to read is about this whole issue of carbon and biodiversity and how we make sense of it and how to think about it. And so this is sort of the view from above. And then the second thing I want to read goes into the forest with somebody who lives there and tells what that's like. So that's what the program is. So megaforests, which is what we call these 5 really big forests, are both more biologically diverse and more heavily stocked with carbon than fragmented ones. That raises a tantalizing question. Is there a universal mechanism that links diversity and carbon accumulation? In intact Congo forests, there's an explicit connection: elephants. They snack on small trees, which allows bigger ones to occupy more space, catch more light, and grow denser wood than the browsed stems would have done. Elephants love big fruit, which comes from big trees. When you come upon their loamy dung in an African forest, you'll often find it sprouting future forest giants. Elephants are thriving in Nuabale Ndoki National Park in the Republic of Congo. According to a 2016-2017 census, the park had over 3,000, or 1 for every 3 square miles of jungle. In a less scientific measure, fleeing forest elephants is a routine part of visiting the area. During a visit in October 2019, I twice ran for my life. This intact forest has 15% more carbon than a comparable patch of Congo woods where elephants have been eliminated. The finding is remarkable and, in a way, surprising, given the roomy feel of a forest sculpted by elephants. Across the Atlantic, Amazon orchid bees live in undisturbed forests only. These flying gems come in a range of metallic greens, blues, purples, and oranges. Some look like they're straight out of a superhero comic, with shiny segments including heavy boots on males' hindmost legs and tongues longer than their bodies. The males alight and quickly squeegee orchid scent off the flowers with wide brushes on their forelegs. They stash the cologne in packets in those hind leg boots for wooing burly females. The female orchid bees pollinate one of the forest's biggest trees, the Brazil nut. It has yellow and white flowers that last for one day only and have heavy lids. Orchid bees depend on their developed musculature to prise open and pollinate the blossoms. The resulting fruits are packed with succulent, oily Brazil nuts encased in a woody shell that's nearly impenetrable, unless you're an agouti. The large rodent routinely hunted across the basin employs a vice-like jaw and chisel teeth to get at the Brazil nuts, but only eats a few from each pod, hides the rest, and forgets where most of them are. The forgotten seeds grow into new Brazil nut trees. If people disturb intact bee habitat or overhunt agoutis, the dense and voluminous Brazil nut trees will vanish from the landscape, leading to a carbon loss. Overhunting of seed-dispersing animals such as spider monkeys, woolly monkeys, and tapirs could cost the Amazon 2.5 to 5.8% of its stored carbon. In some regions, declines of 26 to 38% are possible. One study that involved heroics in data collection showed the importance of fauna for both forest carbon maintenance and restocking. Tapirs are the largest land animals of the South American rainforest. They are tasty and funny-looking and shy, and they are a serious actor in the megaforest's capacity to sock away carbon. The experts estimated that tapirs defecate 1,194 seeds per acre per year in undisturbed forest and up to 3 times that many in forests recovering from human disturbances. Links between forest biodiversity and carbon storage abound. Further, it's clear that a full complement of species makes forests resilient to climate change. That's because if a species should succumb to the shock of change conditions in a forest that still has its full array of native biodiversity, it is more likely to be survived by some other plant or creature, as the case may be, that can fill the ecological gap. So far, no one has identified a single rule of nature that links biological diversity to forest carbon maximization. And I really wanted to find that when writing this book, but it doesn't exist. There are instances where the two go together, and there are vast forest regions in which both are remarkably high. But nature needs insects, birds, and bats that pollinate and spread the seeds of less dense trees. And there are creatures that thrive in a forest with sunny openings in the canopy. Gorillas seek these spots to feast on fast-growing soft-stemmed plants. The urgency of climate change, however, has compelled many scientists, economists, and environmentalists to think about how much carbon there is in everything, even in the bodies of elephants. Carbon, the element, becomes a currency, the unit of measurement in a chemical accounting system we use to chart survival paths for civilization. The peril, of course, is that this carbon myopia conceptually distills the intricacy of a forest ecosystem into a colorless idea small enough to fit in a beaker. Some studies show that when animals are gone, the forest sheds plant carbon. But what do we make of the forest animals whose removal has a negligible impact on carbon? Do we write off the gibbons of certain forests of Southeast Asia, the pollen and seeds of which are windborne? What will become of boreal creatures, even famous ones like caribou, if they are found to be contributing too little to the production of peat? An engineering mindset may also lead us to muse whether the forest might be force-fed a bit more biomass. Some scientists say it might indeed, with performance-enhancing genes that augment photosynthesis and carbon transfer from plant to soil. It's possible, in other words, to juice the jungle. Another idea about which scientific papers are written is to cut down the boreal forest, all of it, so the snow reflects sunlight in winter. This wouldn't work because it's impossible to cut down the whole boreal and keep it from growing back, and raising it incrementally would emit more carbon than the reflective cooling could make up for. In any case, says Michael Coe of the Woods Hole Research Center, an engineering solution that destroys biodiversity is a bad idea. There are always unintended consequences. Carbon myopia clouds the true meaning of the orchid bee and the Brazil nut. Big forests are a linchpin in a planetary system. They are vivid stages for stories about energy and matter that we describe severally with our physical, biological, and chemical sciences. But they are really a single story whose intricacies and meaning we don't fully understand. Orchid bees make Brazil nuts, breed agoutis, take carbon from the air, breathe water back into it, make clouds that make rain 100 miles away that feeds a stream where a catfish, having migrated from the mouth of the Amazon, is caught by an otter, or a person, surrendering its protein to enliven the woods. The bee makes all of these things, and these things make the bee. Losing the forest would change more than the reading on the thermometer. Wind, rain, fire, and ocean currents would be rewritten. If we lose too many trees, everything changes. The weave unravels. Okay, that's the view from above. And now I want to go inside the forest and introduce you to somebody. So where we're going is a place called West Papua. And West Papua, the western side of the island of New Guinea, is occupied by Indonesia. And West Papua is the westernmost part of that. And it's the smallest of the mega forests, but the most mega in terms of cultural and linguistic diversity, and things like birds of paradise and ferns and a bunch of other taxonomic groups. And my guide here is a guy named Derek Membrasser, so that's who you'll hear referred to. By the time we turned off the road and back into the trees, it was fully dark. Our headlamps spotlighted ovals of forest. The ground was soft with slick, exposed roots and occasional creeks cascading in the hillside's deeper folds. The air smelled like earth. We descended, gripping the ground with toes and grasping one skinny trunk after another, careful not to get a handful of millipede. They were 6 inches long, fat and glossy, scaling the slender trees in a nocturnal commute of some sort. Membrasser kept up such a brisk pace that there was no time to ask about them. The dark and the challenge of staying on the heels of a forest native who's darting through the woodland home of uncounted generations of his ancestors induced a sort of mindless focus. The night felt like the start of something. We didn't see much that appeared dangerous. There were no tarantulas or columns of aggressive biting ants. Anyone who has inadvertently grabbed a treehouse of South American fire ants or a spine-encrusted palm in Central America looks before handling a tree. Deadly vipers, common in many jungles, are, Membrasser said, not a threat here. A biologist friend later questioned this, saying that snakes called death adders are quite common in this part of West Papua. But it's possible both things could be true. The snakes and other biting, stinging things could be quite common and also not much of a threat if one is walking behind someone like Membrasser on his home turf. We stopped by a tiny stream to refill our water bottles, smoke, and listen. A rufous owl cried in the distance. Another animal's sound made all of us visitors look around at one another. It was a beep, like a gadget running out of batteries. Water frogs barked like German shepherds, and smaller, unidentified frogs yapped like chihuahuas. As we resumed our walk, a new apparition, looking straight at us from about 25 feet away, put the New Guinea megaforest emphatically in its Australasian biogeographic context: a kangaroo. On Mambrasser's command, the rest of us hit the deck and extinguished our lights, gaping at the marsupial irises shining in the guide's beams. I internalized for the first time that New Guinea has kangaroos. I knew about the cute orange tree kangaroos, but this animal, which Mambrasser identified as a kangaroo in Indonesian, and in English officially is called a forest wallaby, is a big, bona fide, jumping around sort of kangaroo. By any name, it's meat. Mambrasser dropped his string bag and, toting a spear he had fashioned from a sapling, advanced. He played his flashlight in the canopy, spotting randomly to bamboozle the animal. The idea was to get the kangaroo to focus on the forest ceiling rather than the man. In many, perhaps most forests worldwide, indigenous people have been quick adopters of firearms. Many still know how to hunt with blowguns, spears, arrows, clubs, and nets, but, given the opportunity, are not immune to the charms of a hunting tool that permits a person to kill things from far away with terrific accuracy. Indonesia, however, does not allow its citizens to possess firearms. In Ayapokyar, a village that we had visited, where the Momo clan lives, most boys and some girls run around with bows and clutches of small arrows. To fish, kids employ arrows fitted with barbed trident points. Adults carry spears or bows in the forest, just as people have done for tens of thousands of years. The Indonesian army and police, however, are not traditionalists. Some use their spare time and ammunition to run side businesses in Papua and West Papua, slaughtering deer, pigs, and kangaroos. Mambrasser briefly confounded the kangaroo. It hopped this way and that on a stage of flat ground in what looked like a dance with the hunter. Presently, however, it hopped over a rise and into the depths of the forest. Shortly before the end of our 4-hour circuit, Mambrasser spotted a kingbird of paradise. The bird was asleep. The man had no qualms about interrupting. Mambrasser trotted over and, with lit cigarette in one hand, leaped like he was grabbing a rebound and snagged the Cicinurus regius specimen off its perch and out of bird dreamland. It was a scarlet and white confection with iridescent turquoise wingtips, electric blue feet, and hazel eyes. The tail feathers looked jeweler-made, twin wires 6 inches long that terminated in coils with emerald tops and spun gold on the bottom. After a few minutes, Mambrasser let it go. This matter-of-fact bit of catch-and-release birdwatching brought home just how fully and physically involved Mambrasser and forest people like him are with the world we call nature. So the role that indigenous peoples play in the stewardship of forest ended up being our marquee recommendation in our book, along with the smart expansion of traditional protected areas like national parks, national forests, and that sort of thing, which come in many, many flavors and categories throughout the world and have increased dramatically over the last 30 years. And the world of the community of nations is now putting forward a target to increase them to 30% of the land and waters by 2030. And the last thing that we highlighted as the big policy recommendation is to keep roads out of the forest. Roads are the #1 vectors of dynamic change in not just rainforests, but the boreal forests as well. And the more you can plan your infrastructure to keep roads in developed areas, the more chance our megaforests are going to have. So I think I'll leave my presentation at that, and welcome your questions. If you want to know about the origins of the book or what we can all do about megaforests or any one of the five. I welcome any kind of curiosity you might have. So thank you.
I would be interested in the origins of the book and with Tom Lovejoy and how that collaboration happened.
So, have some of you heard of Tom Lovejoy before? So he's credited with coming up with the term biological diversity and bringing it into common use in talking about conservation. And Tom, for decades, since the 1970s, has been studying and talking about the importance of unfragmented ecosystems. He set up an experiment in the Brazilian Amazon in the 1970s when the deforestation was really advancing. It was in the middle of the military dictatorship when they had a slogan, which was you got to integrate the Amazon in order not to give it up. And so they were building highways and subsidizing cattle ranching, and the wave of deforestation was going forward. But ranchers were required to keep 50% of their land in forest. And so Lovejoy had this brilliant idea of talking to farmers and said, would you please leave these 50% in these nice square patches of in a variety of sizes that you can study over time. So he was ever a diplomat and a really nice guy, and so people agreed. And he set up these forest plots that have been studied for now over 40 years, showing what happens to forest interior species when the forest is fragmented, when an edge is created. And so we summarize some of these findings over the decades in the book. He also talked about the Amazon as one big system that needed to be managed as a system. And from the 1970s also, there was research showing that rain, when it fell in the Amazon, it fell and then it was evaporated and transpired back into the clouds, and then it moved west and it fell again, and it went up and it went down 5 or 6 times. And so that phenomenon came to be called flying rivers. So you had these westward moving flying rivers and eastward moving regular rivers. And so he really has made a point throughout his life of talking about how the system had to be managed as a whole between the 9 countries that share the ecosystem. And that carbon and water and biodiversity were all part of one machinery. So Tom, in the most, latest part of his life, was talking about this same topic, but about our whole planet, and saying our planet is this biophysical system that needs to be understood that way and needs to be managed with these key parts of it kept intact and functioning so that the whole would function. And so that's kind of where Tom came from. I was coming from a different place, which was, I grew up in California in this tradition of romantic environmentalism about wilderness and about these places with no people where you could go and be quiet, and John Muir and all that stuff, and Aldo Leopold, and the solitude of nature and the contemplative stuff. And then I got involved in working in the developing world, where there were still people in the forest, and where there were development imperatives and poverty, where people, the idea of empty spaces for recreation didn't really compute. And we had to think about this problem in a different way. And in a sense, we really overcompensated, and we went to a place of talking about how the forest is valuable economically. And coming up with these metrics to say, well, the forest produces so many vines and so many berries, and it's in Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and the water that's important, and more recently, carbon. But we sort of took the forest apart into pieces and counted up the value of all these pieces. And I got trained in economics, and I was a practitioner of this line of thinking. and found that over and over again it failed to understand the value of really big ecosystems. It just isn't built for it. And it fails to understand the full meaning of nature for human beings. So economics sort of like we ran out of road with that. So where do we go next? And how do we articulate for people to really take action the importance of these ecosystems? So that puzzle is what brought me to the project. And we ended up writing an op-ed in the New York Times in 2018 and had no intention of doing anything further. We kind of made the argument. And then someone suggested that we write a book. So we did. And that's the origin of the book.
What was the actual process of writing, like co-writing, collaborative writing? Was there like, was he the science guy and, you're the word guy, or like how did that?
That's a great question. So we actually had a huge amount of overlap in our expertise because we come from different disciplines, but we'd been involved in the practical business of conservation for decades. And so there was a lot of shared knowledge. And then there was obviously some areas where he had the stronger expertise and other areas where I had the stronger expertise. Tom was very well known and in demand in our community. And so he didn't have as much time as I did to go to West Papua and places like that. And he kind of functioned like the elder in the relationship, where he was older and more experienced. But he functioned as the elder in the sense of knowing the origins of things and knowing the history of how we got to where we are and knowing things that had been tried and the sort of the history of the science so that we could contextualize and understand our moment right now as in that continuum. And also he made me take all the swear words out of the book. Because I would get very passionate about certain things, very, very mad. And he was just this amazing at selling the idea of rainforests and forests in general to a broad array of people by using diplomatic skills. But I think you'll see if you have read it or when you do, that we did it in a way where you wouldn't be able to say, oh, this is written by one guy and this is written by another guy. It's meant to be seamless. So I'll leave the rest shrouded in mystery. Yes?
Talking about you came from a perspective of economics. And, it's just seeing how the world works. There is people were thinking coal is bad. And the thing that actually brought down the use of coal was the fact that natural gas was cheaper. And it seems like economics plays such an important role in accomplishing things that may be beneficial to the planet. Is there any way to harness the power of economics a little more in order to accomplish some of those things? Because I don't see it occurring without it working in concert with higher ideals.
Yeah, I don't think our economic system functions according to ideals. But I guess I would give two answers to your question. One is technological innovation can change the relative cost of different ways of producing the things that we need, whether it's energy or food or transportation, and we see that happening. The example you gave is a great example. The example of renewable energy has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And government can have a role to play in goosing that change. And what Germany did with its solar mandate and what China did with its solar industry got us to a point where the cost of solar fell dramatically. It was pushed past the threshold where it's competitive. and some of those things will happen without government. Some of them are just going to be the natural evolution of technologies that are better. But in the case of forests, I would say that two additional things have to happen. One is governments need to have explicit, strong policies that are spatially explicit about certain forests getting used in a sustainable way, getting protected, preserved, whatever the word you want to use is, but in a way that maintains their ecological function. So whether that's a national park or whether that's recognizing native lands, whether that is the infrastructure piece of not building infrastructure that's going to put those areas at risk. Then the other part, I think, comes back to us, because we are all players in this economy. We're consumers. And we address that a bit in the end of the book, sort of what's your role as a consumer? And over the years, I've gone back and forth on this, thinking, well, individual choices are so small, they don't really make a difference. But then corporations are just these sort of empty vessels that do our bidding, in the marketplace. And I think neither perspective is really true. I think we have a responsibility to do as well as we can in reducing our consumption. And not just buying green, but just buying less as well. Because if you start traveling around in these forests, you will find gold mines, and you will find oil and gas wells, and you'll find places where they're mining rare earth minerals, and you'll find places where they're growing beef and they're growing soybeans to feed livestock in Europe and China, and you'll find stuff that's being made into plastics and copper for our wiring, and it's just everything, wood. So we have to ask less of the forests. And I think that can have a positive feedback loop, because if the consumers are not clamoring for a lot of huge cars and a lot of consumption, the policymakers have a much easier path to putting a stick in place to kind of turbocharge those changes. There is a chapter in the book that's all about economics and the kind of the basic economic or market failures that lead us to the point of having trouble with our forests. Yes?
So it's nice to see someone who can appreciate Brownstein apples as well. I grew up in Northern California.
Good. Where are you from? Oh, okay. Yeah, just over the hill.
So I would imagine that going on a trip, a research trip like this, is kind of a life-changing experience. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some things that you brought home with you that you sort of integrated into your life after experiencing this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And there is actually a scene in the book that takes place in Calistoga. So, yeah. So that's such a great question. And I feel like there are life-changing events that change your life a whole bunch all at once, and there are life-changing events that change it little by little. And I feel like everything that I did to research the book and write it changed me little by little. Talking to the people who live in the forest and manage it and understanding it and understand it, and like probing them about their languages and how they say things like forest and how they say things like nature, if they have a word for it at all, blew my mind more than anything. And really made me step back and think about what are my concepts about the environment, about nature, about forests, about ecosystems that would be completely different if I was speaking it in a different language. And just, for example, I learned just recently from a very close friend who's an indigenous man from the Amazon. I said, Beto, how do you say love in your language? He's like, we don't have that word. You don't have the word love? How do you talk about this? Like, what do you say to a girl? And and he said, usually we say, I'm thinking about you. And love and other kinds of love would be expressed in other ways. There's a couple examples from the book. There's no word for thank you in most Amazonian languages. But do you think they don't have gratitude? How is gratitude conveyed? So I would say most kind of life-changing or mind-altering to me was just interacting with people and linguistic differences. It's pretty awesome also to see a gorilla in the forest, though. Really cool, yeah. Yes, other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
So something I've been wondering about for a long time, and maybe I heard it correctly or incorrectly, but is there a relationship between the density of the wood of a tree and its how much carbon it can store?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the carbon in most trees, it's more or less 50% of the biomass. And so if you're packing more biomass into a given volume, you're going to have more carbon. That's my understanding. Mm-hmm. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, well, so as far as like biodiversity goes, like community, tree planting and, afforestation projects. I don't know, I heard something that really sparked my interest on the BBC a couple of years ago, and it's in the Netherlands and in Germany, in unused spaces in the city, they were planting mini forests where they were taking local species of trees or regionally local species of trees and planting them, and then the biologists were coming in, they're finding out there's all kinds of birds that were coming in that were using that, insects, so I don't know, that for me that was somewhat of a revelation that there can, with such a small space and a very practical basic idea, that there was a change in what was going on in that particular biological space.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example, and I have a couple thoughts about that. One is, so I did the last research trip for the book, and I got home February 29th. It was a leap year in 2020. And I had another trip planned for a couple weeks after that, but then, of course, I didn't take that trip. And I was locked down in the pandemic writing. And so the forest that I had available to me was a logged over redwood forest out by Occidental in the western part of Sonoma County. And it made me think, we all need to fall in love with nature. We all need to think of nature in a sense of kinship if we're going to treat the planet in a way that makes the planet continue to be habitable. And so getting out to where you can and getting access to non-human organisms in where you can, I think, is incredibly important. And that's the feedback that you'll see, not to spoil the end of the book, but that's feedback that we got from people who live in the big forest, is just that love of what's around them. The other thought that I have, there is a chapter about reforestation in the book, and this is a controversial topic, and there is a lot of enthusiasm and big high-profile campaigns like the Trillion Trees about planting lots and lots of trees. And it's what many people think about when they think, what can we do for the forest? Well, let's go plant some trees. And we make the point that I think will probably not be news to this audience, because you're my people, that just keeping the trees that are standing is so much more effective and cheaper, better for biodiversity. You don't have to rebuild the carbon stock over 50, 100 years than planting a tree. So tree planting is not plan B for saving the forest. It's in addition to. And there are big regions, wherever it's practical, I'd say, in that urban setting. There are big regions of the world that have been identified where they used to have a lot of trees, and they don't anymore, like the Atlantic coast of Brazil, like the Atlantic coast of West Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of the U.S., where there's scope for tree planting. But even there, it's tough because those places have been, farmers have dug in there, and they're part of their economies and the livelihoods and culture to be using that land in a different way. That was a rambling answer to your question, but I hope it's helpful. Yes.
First I want to thank you for both the presentation and this really important book. And I hope it gets out to a lot of people because I feel like the education component, we're still down there, like you just brought it up about people's view of just planting trees as a solution while we're logging the heck out of the last remaining intact forests, and the Amazon's burning at a higher rate than ever, and they're logging the boreal forest for toilet paper, and biomass is considered green energy by clear cutting bottomland hardwood forests, and I could go on. And I feel this incredible sense of urgency right now because once they're cut down, there's a long time before there's a return. So I just wondered your thoughts about addressing that because it's, it's happening fast and we're losing these intact forests at the very time we need more than ever to be keeping them for carbon biodiversity and the future of our planet.
One thing that we try to do in the book is talk about what's working. And as an environmentalist, by profession, I would have slit my wrists a long time ago if there wasn't good stuff also happening. And what I did my first work as a volunteer in Brazil in 1991, and there was no environmental movement. There were no professional organizations. There were very few nonprofits. The states did not have environmental agencies. The federal government barely had an environmental agency. Now they have an incredibly sophisticated environmental movement, professional programs at all the major universities. All the states have environmental agencies. The federal government has an environmental apparatus that the current president has tried to destroy, but it's there. They're using technology in ways that that has leapfrogged the United States. So there's tons of cool stuff happening, and I get a lot of hope from the surge in interest in indigenous stewardship of land. And what we try to do in the book is just see, okay, where is this stuff working? And what are the conditions under it's working, and what are the threats to those good models, and what are the policies needed to address them? But I don't know, I go back and forth all the time. I mean, there's days of existential despair, but there's, the way that we really propose looking at this is not as a 10-year problem and not as a 50-year problem, but really as like a 300-year problem or a 500-year problem. And that we're going to have a climate crisis. We don't know the full extent of it. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how much it's going to be dystopian, crazy Mad Max world. But where my sort of horizon of hope is we go through that, and that these capacities that we have inside of us, all of us, for cooperation, for recognizing kinship beyond the human community and within the human community, and all this good stuff that people have the capacity for holds sway. And that there's some time down the road when, because of the efforts of a lot of people, some of this biological richness gets through, and to the other side. So that's sort of how I look at it. And day to day, the shit's hitting the fan, and we just have to try to do our best. Yes.
I'm super curious about the forest floor. Did you say it was peat moss?
So in this particular location, it was not. I mentioned peat. So do you want to elaborate on your question?
I was wondering because it tends to have a lot of alkalinity. If there's any correlation between the alkalinity and the ability to create more carbon at all, or if it doesn't matter.
I don't know. Yeah. The soils, yeah, you got me out of my depth. The places where peat accumulates most are in the boreal forest and in some tropical forests, particularly in Indonesia and Central Africa.
But there's some components that need to happen in order for that.
Yeah, so in the boreal forest, I can address that. What happens in the boreal forest is that you have all this vegetative matter that falls off of the trees. And it doesn't fully decompose because either it falls in water or it falls in a place that's very cold and it piles up because there's not enough heat for the microbes that do the decomposing work to do that. So you get a backlog of vegetative stuff falling into mostly wet places. And there's a lot of wet places in the boreal forest because a lot of it's been glaciated and all these depressions have been scooped out. And so that stuff piles up undecomposed and gets compressed, and that becomes peat. And eventually, if that happens for a long enough time, it becomes coal. Oh, that I don't know. Yes. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So you had mentioned sort of, indigenous methods of preservation and stuff like that. And so from my understanding, there's this sort of state-sanctioned aspect of deforestation, but there's also illegal logging and illegal mining and stuff like that goes on that a lot of the indigenous folks have to answer for themselves because there's not like a state way to police that. And so is that like a common thing, or and is that something that they're figuring out right now, and is there conversation about how to sort of address that outside of the tribes themselves having to do it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So in my day job, I work with a community in Brazil that has a 20 million acre indigenous reserve. And the government is charged with exercising some protection for the reserve on who can go in and who can't go in and what they can do. And the government has completely abdicated that on purpose. So the community has started up their own monitoring and patrol corps, and my organization supports them. It buys them boats and gas and drones and that sort of thing. And you see those things cropping up in the sort of the vacuum that obtains in some places those indigenous protection guardians movements. It's a big thing in Canada, More in the sense of occupying ancestral territory, just being on the land, being a presence and sort of reasserting their place, doing monitoring also, some policing and scientific monitoring. And so you see some cool initiatives that are responding to those pressures. It's totally different in New Guinea, for example, because 90% of the land is still controlled by the traditional owners. So, people like his family still basically own the whole forest. And they manage it according to custom. And they don't even have, it's not ownership what they have. They have these layers of rights and access that get continually renegotiated. So that still is what that is most vulnerable to is well-meaning or not well-meaning governments or organizations coming in and saying, hey, we want to make a map of your territory for you and like write down who it belongs to, or create a structure in which you could lease it. So there are all these ways that the outside world tries to create a way to alienate the land from the people. And it's a big struggle. And we talk about in the book, there's a chapter called Guardians, and we talk about the different legal structures that exist in the different parts of the world. And in some places, it's quite strong and inspiring. And in some places, like the Congo Basin, for example, or the Russian taiga, indigenous land rights are still very minimal. Yeah? Yes, sir.
Forest guy here, do they have like a marketable product that they're, or products that they're bringing out of their forest?
Yeah, they do. They have a variety of products that they grow. I mean, mostly it's subsistence. So they have small plots that they clear in the forest, and they grow taro, and they grow a variety of different crops to feed their families, and then they hunt and fish for protein. And this guy actually is a great hunter, and so he will sometimes hunt and sell meat in the town where he lives. And people have different small-scale commerce and sidelines alongside the subsistence economy. They also do sometimes accept deals from loggers. And we got to go through a forest where there was a part that had been logged, and where a landowner had said, yeah, I want the money. And another part that hadn't been logged, where they didn't need the money or had their own particular reasons not to go down that path. So characterizing them as some sort of environmental saints is also not true. And we try to be balanced about that, about there is this incredibly strong grounding in history and knowledge in the forest, but then there is also this interaction with the market economy and the modern world, and the need to pay school fees, and the fascination with cell phones, and all the cool stuff that we walk around with.
So is your forest guy, does he have like, does he get the information coming into his area about what's going on the big, global scale?
That's a great question. The people, even in the really remote areas, they're on social media. They're tapped in through WhatsApp and Facebook, and they have networks. The indigenous people have incredible social media networks. And so it just depends what they're looking at, what they're paying attention to. Are they reading the BBC? Are they reading the New York Times or their national newspapers? I think there was nowhere where we went where we said climate change and people gave us a blank stare. And they're aware that there's a developed world out there that is worried about the forest and wanting the indigenous people of the far north and of the tropics to save their forests. So there is an awareness of some of those global ideas, definitely. Okay, folks. Oh, did
Would you say that their society in a whole is maybe a little bit more healthier,
physically?
physically, mentally?
Yeah, I would say so. I've never been asked that question, but if you just look at the people, they're strong. They don't have the lifestyle diseases, the non-communicable lifestyle diseases. Now, you go somewhere like the Pacific Islands, and you can find plenty of diabetes and obesity, but the forest people, absolutely. There was one study that I didn't manage to get the author to authorize me to use it in the book, but she had looked at the pygmies that we traveled with in the Congo and looking at their arm strength, and they had stronger arms than the very, most high-level rock climbers in the world. And they're eating good stuff. I mean, spiritually, I was just hanging out with a Blackfeet friend last night, and we were talking about spirituality, and he has a spiritual framework and tradition that's rooted in land, and I'm this sort of waif from a rootless culture that we kind of have to make it up if the religion that was on offer for us doesn't make sense or isn't connected to land. So I think in a spiritual sense too, it's something to be envied or studied, the spiritual connection, the spiritual connection and the sense of obligation that it gives people to places. All right, well, I'm happy to take more and more questions, but we're past time, so.
Do you have some suggestions for us?
Yes, I do. My two main suggestions would be go out in the forest and enjoy yourself. And second would be just try to be a conscientious user of, consumer and user of material stuff. And my third is read the book.